Hey guys, welcome to the DarshanTalks recording and podcast. On this podcast, we discuss life science, legal, and regulatory issues, especially in the context of medical affairs, clinical research, and promotional compliance. If you like these videos and podcasts, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You know you want to. This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on PRC review, MRC review, developing SOPs, training, audit compliance, and more. Reach out to Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. Or you can just visit our website at DarshanTalks.com or visit the law firm website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com. Hey guys, really excited to be here. I know it looks like I just shaved in like the last 30 seconds because I'm wearing the same exact shirt. But it's really good to be here. I get to talk to the one, the only Reid Blackman. Turns out there is more than one Reid Blackman, but he's the only one that matters apparently. So I'm very excited to have him. It was really tough to schedule him because turns out he is all over the world, changing lives and taking names. As of today, he is a board member in a very, very fancy organization, which we're hoping to get into a little bit. But I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit before we jump into today's discussion. Reid?
Okay, sure. So I'm Reid Blackman. I'm the author of Ethical Machines, Your Concise Guide to Totally Unbiased, Transparent, and Respectful AI, published by Harvard Business Review Press. I'm the CEO of Virtue, a digital ethical risk consultancy. I'm the volunteer chief ethics officer for the Government Blockchain Association. I am, as of yesterday, I think, a member of the advisory board for Equidium Health, an AI and blockchain based company that gives patients control over their data. Advisor on a handful of other startups, advisory board member. I don't know, there's stuff. I was in EY's AI advisory board. I was a senior advisor to the Deloitte AI Institute. I was a philosophy professor for a decade, and other, lists of things that nobody really cares about.
I'm sure that's not true, but it's humble. So let's start from the beginning. We're talking about the use of AI, and we're talking about the use of ethics in this context. And you are a ethics professor and a philosophy professor. So I got to start from the beginning. When you're judging the ethics of AI, do we look at sort of how we get there, and is it ethical, the process to get there, or do the ends justify the means?
Well, so look, one way to think about this, since you're already in healthcare and life sciences, how do you approach medical ethics? Or what's medical ethics about? Right? There's loads of certain
kinds of decisions. Are you asking this question, or are you just that?
Sure. Yes, I hereby ask you that question.
No, I think medical ethics is about what's best for patients. So we're looking at it from the patient's viewpoint and going, is what we're doing in the best interest of the patient? So it is
the patient,
in that context.
The patient, is it only the patient, the set of patients? It's also the research subject, right? Sometimes it's not a patient, it's a research subject.
Absolutely.
What about the community as a whole? What about, we want to collect some data so we can figure out how to treat a raging pandemic? Those are all
valid questions. But I think that's
not just about, medical ethics is not simply about a doctor's obligations towards their patients.
I would disagree with you on that point. And the reason I would disagree with you on that point is not because everything else doesn't matter. It all flows, at least from a Western philosophical perspective, as to whether that individual patient is benefited. I think that overall we are hoping that everyone else also benefits as a result of it. But if the person in front of me is not benefiting, if my patient is not specifically benefiting, and maybe this is the lawyer in me coming out, but my client is the only one I do and owe a duty of loyalty to. Go ahead.
Look, so suppose you're not the doctor. Suppose you're the CEO of the hospital.
Okay.
And you've got to make decisions or play a role in policy creation that doesn't impact just if you like the CEO's patient, because they don't have patients, but influences the set of patients that come to that hospital. And the policies are not going to impact everyone in exactly the same way. There's going to be differential impact across individuals, across various kinds of subpopulations. And those are going to be ethical decisions that are to be made, right?
Absolutely. But I think I cheat around that question by saying that's not medical ethics anymore. Those are business ethics.
I mean, can't it be both?
It could absolutely be both, but I'm trying not to be caught up in the philosophical quagmire. But go ahead.
My only point here is that, look, there's a range of, call it business decisions, call it medical decisions, there's a wide range of ethical issues.
Absolutely.
That may or may not coincide with various kinds of business or bottom line issues in the medical industry, in medicine and healthcare and life sciences, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be the same thing in AI. Now, there's not, as you point out, there's not this very special relationship that doctors have with their patients. Nothing comes to me off the top of my head anyway, top of my mind, that there's a doctor-patient relationship. That's a very special kind of relationship. When I say it's a special relationship, I mean that it generates certain kinds of special obligations. Correct. And we don't have, I don't think, an analog to that in at least the general AI space. Now, doctors using AI, well, now we do have some kind of special relationship, but it's not because AI is involved, it's because of the doctor-patient relationship that exists to begin with. The general point, though, is that there's all manner of roles and responsibilities, including ethical responsibilities, in the world of medicine and in the world of AI.
Yeah. So how do we begin parsing that question? And the reason I'm asking this question is you mentioned a few minutes ago that you are guiding companies who are, and when I say guiding, both from a professional standpoint, where you do this type of advisory consulting, and from a philosophical standpoint, and from a board standpoint, you're guiding these companies. How do you approach that question? Because as a company, your role is to maximize value for shareholders. However, as you start adding these layers of questions that you need to consider, do you take away from the question of, is this best for my shareholders? Does that question make sense?
Well, yes. Well, I think I heard two questions. One is, how do you advise something like, how do you advise companies in light of the fact that they've got a bottom line to pursue?
Yeah.
And then I thought the other question was something like, how do you advise companies given that there's all this, maybe you weren't saying this, but this is what I thought you were, this is where I thought you were going, given all the disagreement that there is about ethics, or given that there are all these kinds of issues, how do you even begin to guide them on such things?
I would augment that just a little bit in the context of the AI and healthcare space. How would you use those ethics? But yes, absolutely.
Okay. So okay. With regards to the bottom line issue, the short answer, so there's a couple things to say. One is to say that's not my province, right? I give advice with regards to ethics, and the business leaders that I'm advising will have to make certain kinds of decisions based on their financial risk appetite, their ethical or reputational risk appetite, their legal risk appetite, and so on, right? I can't make that decision for them. I can just show them all that I can from the perspective of someone who's focused on ethical risk.
Yeah.
Okay. They have to make the ultimate call about what's to be done. I help them see the ethical risk landscape clearer than they had before. I help them disentangle confusions, disentangle concepts, get them to see what a not unreasonable person may ethically object to.
But let me ask you a question. That makes sense if you are a consultant. If you're on the board, I don't think you can disentangle yourself just as easily. As a consultant, you absolutely could.
So I'm on the advisory board, right? So I'm an advisory board, not the board of directors.
Got it. Thank you.
If I were on the board of directors, I would have a sort of dual role. One would be to say, look, here's the set of kinds of ethical risks that we should be thinking about. Here's what a not unreasonable person might register as an ethical risk. And here's how they might think about the severity of that risk. Then there's a separation about the probability of that risk being realized. Mm-hmm. I may also have a responsibility, and I do in certain contexts, to say, look, here's my view. I think that concern is not really, that ethical concern is not well placed. Here are the reasons why, blah, 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 blah. But I take it that I have a twofold responsibility. One is, in that context, one is to help others see the ethical issues more clearly, and so they can make better informed decisions. So that's my capacity as an advisor. In my capacity as someone who's helping to run an organization. So for instance, as chief ethics officer of the Government Blockchain Association, that is a role where I have this dual responsibility. One, to help other senior leaders at the organization understand what the ethical risks are. The other to say is, look, here's my judgment. Here's what I think that we ought to do. And here's why.
Okay. So
that's yeah.
No, please continue.
So I want to say one last thing. So that's a bit about sort of the two different kinds of roles I can play and do play. Another is about how the advice around ethical risks relates to bottom line considerations. I'll just, one caveat there, one asterisk is that one thing to point out is long-term shareholder value versus short-term shareholder value. And so there will surely be cases of short-term financial gain, shareholder benefit when sacrificing certain ethical standards. Of course, those possibilities arise. They probably also almost surely arise long-term shareholder value, but that's at least more contentious because arguably when you act in an ethically odious manner and that kind of thing goes viral, it gets published by, New York Times, the Washington Post, wherever it is, that really hurts the extent to which your clients, your customers, your patients trust you. And of course, that's going to have an impact on your bottom line. So it's highly contentious, I think, to think that, especially in this day and age of social media, that you can just do ethically disgusting things and it's not going to impact your bottom line. In many cases, it will. Okay. The third thing to say is that, and this is more specific to ethical advice around AI, is that what's interesting from a sort of ethical perspective about AI is the way that it operates. And so because it operates in a certain way, because in particular, machine learning, the most common form of artificial intelligence around now, because machine learning works the way that it does, it highly increases the probabilities of certain kinds of risks being realized. So the big three, that I call them at least the big three, are biased or discriminatory models, black box models, and privacy violations. It's the nature of the beast of machine learning that it highly increases the probabilities of those risks being realized. So part of the advice consists in saying, hey, listen, these kinds of risks, the probability of them being realized is highly increased because of how machine learning works. What are you doing to identify and decrease the probability of those risks? And those three risks are separate from, and being able to identify and mitigate those risks is separate from the task of identifying use case specific ethical risks. So those ethical risks are by virtue of the way machine learning works, but there's lots of applications for AI, countless applications of AI that come along with very specific use case specific ethical risks. And then the question is, okay, organizationally, how do you identify and mitigate those as well? So that's when we start to get more about AI specific ethical risks and advising around that, and what companies can do to create an organizational capacity to mitigate those risks.
So what I threw up on the screen that you can see is exactly the type of discussion, very, very on point, about a large company dissolving a team that essentially, and again, to be fair, I haven't completely gone into it, but they called it the Responsible Innovation Team, and they dissolved it, which I assume it went into some of those exact ethical risks. As an ethicist, as someone who actually deals in AI, and I recognize Facebook doesn't necessarily go into that, but do you see this as concerning, or does it just mean that they are? And again, we both don't have inside information on Facebook.
Exactly, yeah. So first of all, Facebook uses, or Meta uses, a ton of machine learning, ton of AI. I mean, your newsfeed is generated by ML, by machine learning. For one example, or the ads that you get served are that targeted marketing is a function of AI. Okay, it's certainly a bad look, right, to dissolve your responsible innovation department. The question is why, and like you said, I don't have any insight into why they dissolved that particular department. I will say, for what it's worth, that I do know some people who work at Meta, and especially on the privacy side of things, and there is a surprisingly robust practice, surprising to me anyway, robust practice around trying to respect people's privacy. Now, it may be surprisingly robust. Is it sufficiently robust? I don't know. I have not worked with Meta, so I don't know what's actually going on internally. So I don't know whether it's sufficiently robust. And the second thing is, does the work that the existing privacy teams do, is it redundant with what the responsible innovation team was doing? Again, I don't know. So obviously this is a really bad look. Is it more than a bad look? We'd have to have some real investigative journalism, or I'd have to be hired by them to really get into the weeds to find out what's actually going on here, why they dissolved the team. I don't know why.
So, and that's exactly where we should end it. We don't know why, and if we did, we shouldn't be talking about it. But
it's worth. I mean, some people just take the cheap shot, right? Some people just say, "Oh, look, Meta's so unethical; they just dissolved the responsible innovation team." It's an easy cheap shot to make. I mean, they're such an easy target for actual documented moral wrongs. So, like a genocide. So they're an easy target, and it's easy to pile on. So I think it's worth raising just to say, hey, listen, maybe let's see what else they're doing, and maybe we'll still find that. Maybe I'm too generous, but my inclination is to say, yeah, maybe this was the right call. I don't know. I don't know what else is going on over there.
Exactly. And I fall in the same thing, which is and this is probably me as a lawyer. I just don't know enough, and I'm not going to comment on something that might come back to bite me if I don't know enough information. But
right, as a philosopher, I've got high standards for what constitutes knowledge.
Exactly. So let me ask you a different version of this question. Let's say a theoretical company, and not Meta, came up to you and said, we're considering dissolving this group. How would you start approaching this question when you know that they have significant AI and machine learning implications and sort of groups, and the implications on the world are global? I'm going to take it off the screen so we know we're not talking about them.
Sure. I mean, the first question is going to be, okay, so what are you going to do instead? Right? I mean, there's more than one way to skin the cat, right? So maybe what this fictional company is doing is they're saying, you know what, we realized that having a responsible innovation team was too siloed from the actual product design teams. And so what we're going to do instead is we're going to integrate that first line of ethical risk defense into our product teams by training data scientists and product owners and AI engineers, et cetera. We're going to train them up in doing ethical risk due diligence and their creation. We're going to create these risk matrices. We have these new policies, all the kinds of things, frankly, that I advise companies on how to do. And then we're also going to have a second line of defense so that when those engineers and those product owners smell ethical smoke, there's a switch, there's a lever to pull, and that alarm goes to this person or these people or this committee. We're going to staff the committee in such a way. That's possible. I mean, so having a responsible innovation unit, department, it's not obvious that it's a necessary condition for having an ethically sound organization and doing AI ethical risk mitigation well. It may well be a good way, but not a necessary way. And it may turn out that it's in many cases a bad thing, a bad method, because it's too siloed from what product people are doing day in, day out.
So that raises the question.
Organization.
That to me raises the question of the future. And what I think about is we've worked off of the model of IRBs in clinical research forever, for the last 50 years. And to me, they are the life sciences equivalent of a responsible innovation team. Using AI, using machine learning, using blockchain, what are the new ways to conceptualize the next version of the IRB?
So, I mean, look, I'm a huge fan of the IRB model.
Okay.
I say that in recognition of the fact that there's lots of I don't know about IRBs, and that I know that there are problems with them. They're not always staffed with the right people who have the relevant expertise. There's often conflicts of interest. I get that there are problems with them, but I'm considering, what they were a response to when they were created. They're doing. From a relative outsider's perspective, they're doing a pretty good job. I'm not saying there's not lots of issues, but I haven't seen a better way of dealing with systematic ethical risks in an industry. And so I think that we do need something like IRBs. Here's the another reason why I think we need IRBs and AI ethics and blockchain ethics. when you look at the regulations that are coming out now, so there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of regulations. There are the outcomes-based ones and there are process-focused ones. The outcomes-based ones say, listen, for instance, every car by 2035 has to get 50 miles per gallon or be electric or something. So I don't care how you get there, more or less, I don't care how you get there, but that's the output that we need. Now, the regulation requires a certain kind of output from car manufacturers. You're not going to get that with AI because the use cases are in the, I don't know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. I mean, the countless use cases, right? So it's not going to be that you need to create an AI that's like this. It's going to, maybe they'll say that's unbiased. Okay, but what's the process by which you determine whether it's unbiased? What counts as sufficiently unbiased? And then it's going to be use case and context specific, and the regulations are not going to be able to speak to such fine-grained situations. So the regulations are going to have to be process-focused as opposed to outcome-focused. Like, you need to check for bias and document it. You need to check for, whether it's a black box and document why you chose to use a black box or why you didn't. You need to, but it's all going to be process-based. And so then, to me, the question is, okay, what does the process require in order for it to be ethically robust? And then I can't see how the answer to that is going to stray very far from, well, it should include something like an IRB. It should include something like an independent set of hopeful experts who can assess these things, well, because they have the requisite training, knowledge, experience, so on and so forth, lack of conflict of interest, as opposed to, oh, the data scientists will figure it out. That's the same thing as saying, oh, well, the research scientists will figure it out. No. We give the research scientists, medical research scientists, training around ethics and standards, yada, yada, but we don't say that's sufficient. We say they need external oversight by an IRB. And I don't see how we can conclude that the data scientists who are building machine learning models for Meta, Google, pick a startup, whatever, how they are going to be better at internalizing and executing on ethical standards in a way that, say, people with MDs or PhDs in biotechnology or whatever it is can't. Of course not. They also need that external oversight. We're not going to get it, but that's what we need.
To me, IRBs suffer from the ethical or moral conundrum of who watches the watchers, and in that, I think maybe the answer is OHRP or AHRP or FDA, but I think that there are limits. And what I mean by that is, on one hand, IRBs are in many ways the final authority on whatever research is being done. And the problem with that is the IRB could be wrong. And I've been in situations where I personally think the IRB is just wrong. There's no appeal process. They claim they have an appeal process, but you can't really argue that it's sufficient or anything like that.
Sure.
And so I might argue that, is that necessarily the right way when they have so much control and so much power? And that becomes a big issue. The other issue I have with IRBs is the tendency for scope creep. They are generally known to have this scope of issues they can get into. I have routinely been involved in IRBs looking at these other issues, and these other issues are understandably something that the IRB may have an interest in. And I think a really good example of that is privacy, where an IRB necessarily does have an interest in maintaining patient privacy. However, I'm not sure, and I have to look at it again, but the last time I checked, they don't necessarily have jurisdiction over privacy. They are not a privacy board. So the question then becomes, who tells them, you can't tell me how to maintain my subject's privacy because you just don't have the authority to do that.
Yeah.
So how do you think AI offers a more controlled mechanism that maybe gets appealed to an IRB instead of directly going to them and having no appeal process?
Okay, so you raised two issues. One is sort of a subsection of the other. So one is that they get it wrong sometimes. A subsection of that is, and you can't appeal it.
Yeah.
And then the other is scope creep or mission creep or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take those in turn. So, of course, they're going to get it wrong.
Right.
Of course. What's the alternative? divinely inspired and guided IRBs. I mean, that's not an option. But neither is having divinely inspired and guided data scientists working on machine learning. That's not an option. Okay, so the mere presence of mistakes shouldn't be enough for us to say, well, then forget the whole thing. Right? The criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Juries make mistakes. Really bad,
Agreed.
life-altering, in some cases, life-ending mistakes.
100%.
We don't say, well, to hell with the criminal justice system. We don't say, forget about juries and judges. That they make mistakes. Of course not. Okay. So then the question becomes not whether we should have such things, but what are the things that we can put in place to decrease the probability of mistakes being made? Okay. One such answer is plausibly, among other things, there's a method of appeals to a different body. I'm fine with, at least in principle, with an appeals process of some kind. Probably for IRBs, certainly in an AI IRB situation, I don't see why we have to take over the non-appealability from IRBs. It's it's got advantages. It also has disadvantages. I'm not an expert on the advantages and disadvantages, I should highlight. But in principle, we have appeals in the criminal justice system precisely because we think that the first pass might get it wrong, and we have an increased probability of righting wrongs if we allow for an appeals process. Okay, so sure, allow appeals and other things around what would decrease the probability of them being wrong. So for instance, being very diligent about making sure that no one with a conflict of interest serves on the board. Being diligent about ensuring that the people on the board have the right experience or the right knowledge or the right training, etc. Right? If you get someone on there who can't even spell ML or AI, you've got a problem. That's not the right person to have on the board. I also probably think you need to, rethink, a representative from a member of the community. That might not be the right way to construct the board, especially because AI is built to scale across tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and so having a community member doesn't really make a lot of sense when you're impacting, potentially every community on the planet.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the they gotta get it wrong sometimes. Okay, it's not in the job of getting it right all the time. It's in the job of it's in the job of making it the case that there are fewer wrongs than there would be without them. Roughly, yeah. That's roughly the way to put it. And I think that if you just leave it in the hands of the AI engineers, the data scientists, and that's it, I think the rate of wrongings will be higher than the rate of wrongings if you were to have an IRB. Okay. The second thing that you said is scope creep or mission creep. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, what that means is that you need to think about what's the scope and be diligent about thinking through what that scope does and does not include. We already had a nice guinea pig for such a thing for AI IRBs, medical IRBs. And so we can think about the ways in which the scope has creeped in a way that's been deleterious to healthcare and life sciences generally, bad for patients, bad for doctors, bad for researchers, et cetera. So we can think about those kinds of things. And it's not as though any of these things are set in stone. We can revisit. But to me, the fact that there could be mission creep or scope creep is a red flag. Doesn't raise the red flag of maybe we shouldn't do it because of mission creep. It's what are the controls we can put in place to decrease the probability of mission creep?
It's a fair point, but then I say this against my own brethren, but don't IRBs suddenly go from being an ethical body to being a legal body, where you need a lawyer on every single one of these things to go, well, according to privacy laws, this is really what the privacy would implicate, and therefore it's okay or it's not. And that's not why the body exists.
The short answer is I don't know. Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. Look, within the law, there's going to be lots of ethical positions you can take up, right? So Absolutely. Some hospitals are religious hospitals, and they have certain kinds of ethical standards that are permitted but not legally required. In other hospitals that are not religiously affiliated, they're also legally compliant, but they don't do some of the stuff that the religious hospitals do, or they do stuff that the religious hospitals don't do.
Right.
And an IRB for, so this is a way of saying something like these standards, there will be legal standards inside which different organizations can play, so to speak, and have different ethical standards, different ethical risks. I take it one of the core features of the IRB, at least in an AI context, is to of course, highlight the things that are just positively illegal, but also to point out the kinds of ethical risks that are involved that they might not have thought of otherwise. So to give you an example that's relatively recent, and there's also a Radiolab episode on this recently, there was the team who used AI to discover different kinds of molecules for cure certain kinds of diseases. You hear about this?
I did.
And they went to a security conference, and someone said, well, couldn't you use that to figure out certain kinds of poisons? And lo and behold, they figured out, I forgot how many, but lots of ingredients for how to kill people, lots of new molecules that can be created. And to me, one of the shocking things about this is that before they were asked the question, the team had never even thought about it. They were like, oh, yeah, right, I forgot. We never thought that we could just, and this is what they did, they changed a 0 to a 1. We never thought that we could just set our AI to start creating, genocidal warfare chemicals. That's amazing that they didn't think about that. That's amazing. I don't mean that in a laudatory sense.
Right.
But if there were an IRB or something like an AI IRB that they went to, they would say, hey, you might, it's not legally problematic, technically speaking, but here's a massive ethical red flag that you might want to think about before you start doing this thing, or before you start sharing this with people, or before, et cetera, et cetera. That's useful for an organization. And then I think there has to be other things built around the IRB, which is like transparency around what decisions were made. Part of the function of, at least as I envision it, something like an AI IRB is public accountability. The means by which, say, public watchdogs can watch and see what kinds of substantive, legal but ethically questionable decisions are being made by organizations as they develop their ML. And as of right now, we have no means by which to see what those substantive decisions are, right? So, I mean, we have seen things like, well, look, it's legal to create a news feed in such a way that it causes depression among teenage girls. Did they explicitly make the decision to stick with that way of creating the newsfeed because it increased quantity of clicks? I think so. There was a report on this a couple of years ago, right? I think the answer is yes, but that's because someone did some investigative journalism and found out. But if there were a systematic way of certain kinds of decisions having to pass through a kind of board, some of that information of which is transparent or public, so that the public can know, wow, that company made what ethical, legal but ethically charged decision? Oh, that's a way of holding organizations accountable.
It's interesting. Like, several things popped out for me as you were discussing this. The first one is it reminds me. I didn't know about this specific instance on the newsfeed causing teenage girls to go through depression, but it reminds me of that case. I think it was like Ford or something like that all those years ago, and essentially they made a decision that it's cheaper to, that their car would burst into flames if in this unique situation. And they said the probability of this happening was low enough that we'd rather pay the fines. And that, to me, it's exactly the same, but from a technological perspective. It's ethically possibly dubious, but it's a risk we're willing to take, if you will. The second thing.
So the question is, given that a lot of companies using AI are using things that are meant to operate at scale, and they're having these massive impacts on society, does something like society at large have the right to know what the ethical risk appetites of those companies are? I forgot. I've lost track of plural and singular. But
right.
Do they have a right to know what the risk appetites of those organizations are? Or should people generally be completely in the dark about what kinds of substantive, ethically charged decisions those companies are making?
I love it. Transparency at scale.
I think there's some. Yeah, and yes, that's right. I think that's fair. I mean, it's transparency not for its own sake, but it's transparency so that people can hold them accountable in some way or other, even if it's not legally accountable.
Right. Though I think we're seeing a lot of that, aren't we? In general, where we're seeing Twitter take on that role of going after people, even if there's no actual strict legal requirement.
Social media generally, the movement, the ESG movement, environmental, social, and governance factors being factored into investment decisions. The United Nations and Sustainability Development Goals. I mean, these are all plus what journalists are interested in, publish about, plus what's on not just Twitter but social media generally.
Yeah.
Companies lose trust. They lose clients and customers because people think they're shady.
Yeah. The other thing that sort of came out at me, which was you were talking about it's surprising. I'm trying to remember the context, but you were surprised about the types of people looking over your shoulder. And it reminded me of something where have you heard of the term biohacking?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a client who actually asked me to look into this for him, and he was really surprised by the answer. Who do you think is responsible to look at whether biohackers are doing research appropriately? I'll tell you my answer. My answer when I was thinking about it should have been like the FDA or AHARP or something, NIH maybe. Turns out the answer is like the CIA and the FBI, which made no sense to me.
I wasn't gonna guess that.
Yeah, and the reason of it is, in the end, research is about generalizable knowledge. If you're doing it only to yourself with no intention of giving it to anyone else, it's not research. So suddenly you lose jurisdiction from NIH and FDA and the like. And again, just to be clear, this is not legal information, or this is not legal advice. But that is how they ended up losing jurisdiction. However, when you start taking modified vectors and you start injecting into yourself, you raise the question of what if those vectors get out? And now you're talking about causing harm to other people who didn't ask for it.
Sure.
So suddenly you're looking at FBI, CIA type of stuff, which was mind-blowing to me. So again, it goes to, I think you were talking about impact on communities, and an unexpected jurisdiction, I think, is really where we landed up there. And the last question, again, we're well past time. We're very well past time. But the part that stuck out to me was this idea of transparency and how organizations should be more transparent about decisions. I agree with you 100%. But I think, why stop at private organizations? Why not include government organizations? And the branch of the government that's very, very open, in my opinion, are the courts. They have to write down exactly why they decided one way or the other. And they have to explain, in most cases, why they decided one way or the other. But I've been an advocate for several years on this idea of FDA says yay to certain drugs and no to other drugs.
Yeah.
If you could tell us why you made that decision, not just tell us, I went through this checklist, but here is what we considered, here's the precedent we considered, we therefore came up with this decision, we can stop wasting billions of dollars. We can start looking at making smarter decisions on which drugs to pursue, which ones will not get through the FDA because of their current thought process. Have you seen any conversations on applying that level of transparency, whether through AI, whether through machine learning, or otherwise, to governments to say we expect that same level of transparency?
I mean, in the AI world?
Sure.
Okay, so there's a couple of things to say. There's a bunch of things to say. Number one is a lot of the regulations, especially coming out of the EU, there's the EU AI Act, which will probably be the first AI regulations to really impact people worldwide.
Yep.
There's lots around documentation, which is to say being transparent about what,
Yeah.
Why did you choose the model that you did, and how did you check for bias, and why is it a black box, or is it a black box, and how did you test this, how did you validate? So there's stuff coming. When people talk about regulations, they talk a lot about documentation for AI, which is a way of talking about transparency.
But that transparency is still on how the companies made the decisions, not how the government made the decisions.
Sure, that I don't know anything about.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
One thing I want to say though is that I'm sort of torn in two directions. I don't have a final position on the importance of transparency or how it works exactly. Yeah. So one thing to say is that you look at various companies that are touting their AI ethics principles, and transparency is always one of them, which is kind of silly because They just say we're for transparency. We'll be transparent, but of course, we're not going to be transparent to everyone about everything. Right? Here's our IP, right? They're not going to do that. So it's always specified at too high of a level to be meaningful. But the other thing that I find really fascinating is a paper written by a philosopher whose name I can't recall at the moment. Recently, within the past couple of years, I think, at one of the best philosophy journals, and the title of the paper is "Transparency is Surveillance."
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, great title. And so the idea is roughly, look, surveillance is bad for a variety of reasons. I mean, usually when you're talking about surveillance, excuse me, you're talking about a third party who is uncharitably interpreting the things that you're doing. That's what surveillors are doing, right? So when the cops are checking you out, they're not looking with, oh, maybe he's just, maybe those those pills are prescribed, right? That's not what they're thinking. Governments surveilling, they're looking uncharitably, and arguably because what they're trying to do is decrease their risk, right? They want to decrease their, the less charitable we are, the more likely we are to catch the bad guys.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a certain rationale there. Transparency, forcing for certain kinds of companies to be transparent about certain kinds of decisions, is a way of uncharitably looking at what they're doing from a distance. And what does surveillance do in the government sense? It changes your behavior, right? It makes you self-conscious in a way, and you don't do such, you don't do this, you do this instead of that, because that looks bad. It would be fine, but it looks bad.
Yeah.
And so then the idea is that if you force companies to be transparent in all sorts of ways, what you're essentially doing is you're going to cause in corporations the kinds of altered behaviors that you get in citizens when you surveil them, including not being able to articulate expert opinion, not having experts involved. Because if you have experts involved, they're going to make really expert, which is to say nuanced and subtle deliberations and decisions that an uncharitable surveiller will not understand, because that uncharitable surveiller is also not an expert. Right. And so while X is the best thing to do by the lights of your experts, it's going to look bad to the non-experts because they're non-experts and they don't get it. So we're going to do Y instead, which is going to result in worse consequences overall, but it's less explainable to our surveillors. So there's this, I don't have a stance here, but the line of thought is totally fascinating, and how it all shakes out with the need to hold them accountable, I don't have a view on.
I love it. We're going to have to come back to this topic if you're open to coming back on. But
yeah, I'd love to.
Reid, this was amazing. We're well past time, but any parting words?
Goodbye.
Perfect. These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an